Hi, and welcome to the AIMHO 365 webinar. Looks like a few more folks are getting logged in, so we'll wait for them to get settled, and then we'll go ahead and kick it off. Well, once again, welcome to the AIMHO 365 webinar. This is called No Place for Hate, Responding to Bias and Hate Incidents in Campus Housing. And it's hosted by Kyle Oldham from Colorado State University. And we just want to give a big thank you out to Kyle for being willing to share his information and knowledge with the region and once again supporting AIMHO 365. This webinar will be 45 to 50 minutes in length, and we'll save some time at the end for some Q&A. We'll also be taking some questions during the presentation. So there's a control panel that should have appeared in your upper right-hand corner of your computer monitor. If you have any questions about the material that's being covered, please feel free to submit your questions using the chat box. I will be helping Kyle monitor this throughout the webinar, and Kyle will speak to the questions as they come in or at a place that's appropriate during the presentation. You should be able to view the presentation on your screen now, so hopefully you see that nice title page that Kyle has up. I hope you all can hear me as you're watching this webinar. I've muted the microphone feature, so I will not be able to hear you if you ask any questions. If everyone logged in, though, can test the chat feature by typing in your campus name as well as how many people are attending with you today or how many people are viewing. That'll help us get a feel for who's in participation. Feel free to tweet using hashtag AIMHO and @AIMHO. This webinar will be recorded and uploaded to AIMHO 365 YouTube page, and we'll send out a link following the presentation. Please be checking back to the aimho.org website often for future webinars, as well as submitting your own webinar proposals. We love to have people share their knowledge and experiences across the region to make sure that we're doing right by our partners. And again, a huge thank you to Kyle. We're going to go ahead and turn it over to Kyle, and I'll let him get started with his presentation.
All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this afternoon. Hopefully the weather in your area is holding up because it is kind of freezing here. But I wanted to thank you all for being here for the No Place for Hate webinar. Have a few opportunities today to really just dig in and start self-reflecting and thinking about what we have at our own campuses and how we can create a space that will work for us as individuals, as staff members, and creating that campus environment that's holistic and for student success for everyone involved. So just know that there's going to be some self-work along the way that I'll ask you all to dig into, or if you're with other folks from your campus listening to the webinar, to be able to answer those questions with one another. And then we'll use some of the chat features here to be able to share some of that information with one another as well. As Corinne said, my name is Kyle Oldham, and my screen does not want to progress. So let's work on that for a second. There we go. I'm the Director for Workplace and Inclusion and Talent Management at Colorado State University, and my pronouns are he, him, and his. And I am excited to be here with you this afternoon. So just to give you a brief journey as to where we're going to be going, we're going to talk about some definitions to get on the same page. share a few examples of what's been going on around the country, and knowing that where we're at now, more has happened and occurred since this slideshow has been put together. And so definitely recognizing that there are some pieces that have been left out. Talk about what's happening on your campuses, just to give you a chance to talk about that a little bit with one another. I'm going to then share what we've done here at CSU through a case study, and then guide through some self-reflection and solution-oriented thinking. And then, as Corinne mentioned, have a closing where we can ask any and answer any questions that might be happening. So we're going to get started. So these are the four words that I would like to share with us to this afternoon, just so we're on the same page of what we're discussing. So diversity, the very generic definition of that being the various differences within people. We know that diversity a lot of times comes across as a buzzword, or a lot of folks will first hone in on race as being the one thing. When you say diversity, I mean race, but we know that there are a lot of markers and social identities that each of us hold. And so diversity is really looking at the various differences within all people. When we think of equity, it's a state of eliminating conscious or unconscious bias and harassment and discrimination. Just knowing that there's equal access to opportunities. And we know that equity sometimes gets conflated with the term equality, and recognizing that equality is equal for everyone, but knowing that we try to strive for equity because not everyone needs the same resources and access to those resources. So when we talk about equity, we're really looking at those biases and harassment and discrimination that prevents the equal access to opportunities. With inclusion, it's around creating an environment where all individuals contribute fully and feel valued, engaged, and supported to reach their full potential. I know here at CSU, we've really moved towards an inclusive excellence model, really thinking around that inclusion piece of being welcome, valued, and affirmed on our campus. And so definitely taking it to the next level of, in order to achieve equity, inclusion needs to occur because we need to know what biases are out there to be removed. And then last is social justice, which is that full and equal participation of all groups in a society that is mutually shaped to meet their needs. So we really talk about that society that is equitable and all members are physically and psychologically safe and secure. And that's from Adams, Bell, and Griffin. And so really thinking about it's a process and a goal. So in order to achieve social justice, we have to go through a process of social justice, which sounds kind of trippy and meta in a lot of different ways. But we know that these are those four terms that typically are utilized around campus. And so what I'd like you all to do listening is just to think about what these words, if these words are used on your campus, which ones do you typically hear more of? And think about the response that you get when one of these words comes up. So for example, if someone says diversity, does someone roll their eyes? Or if you say social justice, does someone say, oh, those snowflakes? So really think about what's coming up for you on your campus. And I'll give you about 30 seconds to write which words go down and what comes up for folks. So is anyone listening? Would one person like to share through the chat feature here a word that's typically used in the response that comes up for you on your campus? Don't be shy. I'll get the ball rolling. All right. So we don't have diversity or proponents of social justice, but also uses a derogatory term. For example, the social justice warrior. We have that a lot too on our campus, and that derogatory piece is real, where people are always pushing information out. And so therefore that social justice warrior term is then looked at, well, you're not allowing me to grow or learn as well. So I want us to think about this, because this is that acknowledgement that we have to realize around the political savviness, or playing games, as some of my grad students like to call, where we're navigating campus and community politics. We need to be thinking about the words that we use and the words that are going to sort of garnish the most support in some ways. And so we know that sometimes utilizing equity or equality or diversity, it might not be what we're truly trying to say, but if we can use the words that pull our coworkers and colleagues into the place that we're trying to get them to, then we can start introducing new terms and phrases that will hopefully resonate with folks differently. And so as we go through this today, really thinking about how we respond to bias and hate incidences, it's important to know that language plays a big role and a big part of that. And that we know that if folks start shutting down when we start throwing around social justice, how do we start throwing in other terms or phrases, or even showing examples or giving metaphors that will allow people to listen differently? And we know that that sometimes feels uneasy for some of us, and sometimes it feels icky to me as well when I'm trying to water down what I'm really wanting to say. But I also think about the benefits that I will get from getting that person on my team differently. So thank you all for showing that out, showing that on the questions there. So when we think about a bias-motivated incident, this definition that I'm sharing with you now is the one that CSU has used. And so I encourage you, as I share these next examples with you, to really think about what on your campus you all have in place as a policy or a procedure, or where to find those definitions so that your campus can be in the same page. And if you're not finding these resources, to truly start thinking about where you can build these resources and capacity for these resources. So as you can see on the screen, the bias-motivated incident, I'm not going to read all of this out, but I'll sort of paraphrase, is that it's that speech, conduct, or expression motivated in whole or part by bias or prejudice that's meant to demean or mock or marginalize an individual based upon, and you see a long list of statuses there. And so what I appreciate about at Colorado State is that we take the approach that every last thing you see up here is sort of protected under the CSU banner. For sure, and that we list all of these pieces within our non-discrimination policy for employees, as well as our bias-motivated incidents, so we can act on these as a part of our university policy. And so we also then go on to say that a bias-related incident may not reach a criminal threshold, and often these incidences are broadly or generally directed to an individual or group of individuals, or include an action that, while disturbing, is not criminal, such as bias-related speech. Which is often protected under the First Amendment. And we know that over this last year, we've seen a lot of this push and pull taking place, which we'll talk about in just a second. Another thing at CSU is the hate crime piece that we have definitions for. And so it's a criminal act with an added element of bias. So the whole terminology of all hate crimes are not bias-related incidences. All hate crimes are bias-related incidents, but not bias-related incidences are not all hate crimes. And so we like to tell our students and staff that, because a lot of times the ways in which our students want to respond to these incidences are, why aren't they being arrested? Why aren't the police involved? Why aren't we getting these people kicked out of our community? And we have to sort of break down the fact that hate crimes have a very specific statute that has to be followed by our police department. And as you can see on the screen, these are the pieces that at Colorado State, and really pretty much federally and statewide, that really can create a condition for a hate crime to be identified. And so as you can see, there has to be like murder, arson, assault, harassment, vandalism, but but that there's an intended victim or victims that have been identified. And so that was part of when we get to the case study that we had an issue with on our campus, that why it couldn't be classified as a hate crime specifically, but it definitely has to be directed towards a specific person or a group of individuals. And when we think about the difference between a bias-motivated crime and a hate crime, we really talk about what's that. We tell our students, don't worry about defining which one is which. Let's write down and document the fact that something occurred that has created bias in our space, and allow the police to take it to the next level of the hate crime. And so the complexity sometimes is really around what's covered under a hate crime and what's not, is really going to depend upon the state that you live in, because we all have the same federal guidelines for what's considered a hate crime. But I know here in the state of Colorado, sexual orientation and gender identity and expression, I believe, are both covered within our state statutes. But we know that within all of the states within our region of AIMHO, we don't all have the same state statutes. So also, as you continue to write your notes and take your notes, asking that question and figuring out what statuses are protected will help in the conversation when engaging your staff and your both your professional and student staff around what is what is considered a hate crime and what can be protected under a hate crime. The other piece that I mentioned earlier briefly too is really looking at if you have a non-discrimination policy for your university, making that a part of your policies within the housing unit. So how does that align with your conduct, or how does it align with how you create communities and for your students within the residence halls as well? And if you have a relationship with an on-campus police department, by all means, definitely bringing them into the conversation to help define and get the statutes that are for your state, so the language is mirrors and matches well is good. If you don't have a campus police department, definitely reaching out to your campus safety is a great place to start as well. So in the context of today, I want to also share with you the First Amendment that is followed and sort of definitely, what's the word I can use, interpretive by the person trying to be protected under First Amendment. We know that this has been huge in the last year and a half, even over the last 2 years since the 2016 presidential election, that has really been calling into question what is hate speech and what constitutes as hate speech. And so if your university has not received guidance on First Amendment protections, or what the university is willing to define based upon their general counsel as what First Amendment protection looks like, that is also a step in the right direction I would ask that you all do, because that's going to definitely guide how you all will respond to bias and hate incidences, and how you will define and teach and educate your staff in responding. So if you have not had any type of conversation on your campus around how your specific university interprets the First Amendment, that would definitely be another step that you should take as a housing department to be able to protect yourselves on how to engage. We know that I just saw in the Inside Higher Ed that UMass Amherst specifically has a case that is being taken now into the courts, where an RD emailed a student asking them to remove a sign that had some pretty strong language that was facing out the windows that all students were complaining about, and it encompassed using the N-word. And so the RD sent an email saying this is not appropriate, you shouldn't have this up. And therefore that email was then taken, and they were saying that you're infringing upon my First Amendment rights to be able to have that up. This is that tension point around responding to bias and hate incidences that we have to think about around what are our policies around hanging items in windows or outward facing. How do we respond to things, to messages that are outward facing that might not be aligned with what the university espoused values? Is it something you put in an email, or is it a conversation that you have with the student directly, and how you respond to that? Something else that would be key to find out as we go through this process as well. So the next slide that you're going to see is a whole bunch of headlines that we've pulled over the last year or so, just to sort of, again, provide context for what we're dealing with. We know that white supremacy is on the rise across the country. We know that anti-Semitism has been on the rise across the country. There's been a lot of racist, homophobic, and anti-Semitism issues that have been brought to the forefront on college campuses specifically. We've had two of the headlines up there in the upper right-hand corner, and in the lower left-hand corner are from CSU specifically that we've dealt with and have had to continue to process and still are dealing with as a result of the current context and climate that we find ourselves in. What we definitely realize is our basis for this is that we've had to come to an agreement with our general counsel as to really what approach we need to be taking when responding to incidences. But on the flip side of that, our general counsel has volunteered two of their lawyers to sit on a campus-wide committee with us, as well as our assistant vice president for student affairs, We have a director of orientation. There's a housing representative, representative from fraternity sorority life, student organizations, and student conduct all sit in this space, and we talk about how do we teach our students about First Amendment rights, like what is the First Amendment, what does it mean for us as a state entity, and then how do students are agents of the state when they are agents of the state, and then also how do we roll this out to educate our students overall on our campuses. And we found that this helps with not only hopefully being proactive about stopping some headlines from occurring, but also proactive in getting the First Amendment information out there so our students are more aware and understand more how they can engage within their First Amendment rights, but also know that if someone is going to violate those, like a student cannot violate another student's First Amendment rights, but if a student decides to say something that might be unpopular or racist or anti-Semitic, that there are consequences to that, but they might not be consequences that the university can impose because of the First Amendment right, but it might be more of those non-tangible consequences of being in a community with other peers. So I share this with you to know that all these definitions and all these terminologies are pieces that have to be gathered up front for your team to be successful in how you're going to approach. And with some of you responding that we use inclusion, or people don't really care for the word diversity, or equity is not really out there, what are the phrases and words that will be sort of tempered in the way in which it starts with part of our conversation for people to be able to bring into the table and sit and start to listen as to what's going on? So with all of this information, what I'd like us to do is on your campus, within your group that you're sitting with, or self-reflect if you're sitting on your own, is I'd like you to think about the following two questions. What does this topic bring up for you personally? And what's happening on your campus? Who is involved in incidences? Are there offices or students that have been targeted? Are there incidences happening on your campus? What identities are typically involved? Have you all responded so far? And then my favorite one is what do you want to occur personally and professionally? And what I mean by that is, personally, my first response is always, I want to go choke someone. I know this is being recorded and I just put myself out there on that, but it's okay. I know that my first inclination is I want to choke someone for doing what they've done. But professionally, I might have to sit down and have a conversation with them. And it's important for us to know and tease that out because we are individuals and humans, and that we can't always put ourselves and compartmentalize our personal feelings without addressing them first, because it might help us be better professionally. It might help me in the conversation realize that if I wanted to choke someone, I might have to use different words and phrases, and professionally, I might be able to engage with a student or a staff member or a community member in a different type of conversation by sharing a part of my personal story. So I want to give you all about 3 minutes or so just to engage in a conversation or some self-reflection around what's going on for you on your campus and what this brings up, so we can use this for the rest of the presentation. As you all come up with things, if you want to share maybe one incident, not necessarily all the details, but just maybe a general overview of what you might be dealing with on your campus, you can share that through the questions or the chat feature, either one, just so we know what to address, and I can maybe speak to some of that if we've had that on our campus as well. All right, so we're going to move on. Yeah. Edgar, I hear you completely. We have a free speech area on our campus where we have plenty of preachers come talk. Free speech locations. Yeah. And those in free speech is even like a whole nother webinar in and of itself. And that's why I can't emphasize enough to make sure that you're bringing in your general counsel to engage in those conversations as well, because they definitely have that legalese language that they can utilize, as well as what they are willing for the university to get involved with or not. So as you have come up with and continue to discuss and probably give each other eyes across the room, like, oh yeah, you remember that last thing that happened 2 weeks ago, right? Keep writing those things down and thinking about them, because they're really going to serve the basis for maybe ways in which we can start identifying through that solution-oriented thinking piece. So just to share with you our case study that I'm going to use as we continue to talk through the rest of this presentation together. Back in 2017, what you're looking at is a screenshot that was sent of a Snapchat video of our opening weekend. We had that noose hung outside of a residence hall floor 2 days after opening. It was found in a residence hall stairwell outside the wing of a Black identified RA. So again, when we think back to hate crime, the RA wasn't targeted specifically because it was entire floor, which again, very loose, but that's how our legal people decided to look at it as. But if it was on his door, then they would have classified it as a hate crime, which we had to get through the language with our students to make sure they understood that, and they didn't like it and we didn't like it. But RAs who found it immediately took the noose down and no reports were made. So again, stressing, how do you respond and write incident reports or document your situations, making sure that students know. Senior staff saw the post on social media of the noose and reported the incident to residence life staff and police. And within a few hours, campus administrators were involved in the response, including the vice president for student affairs and the CSU president. And so I share that with you if we go back to what was happening on your campus. Again, these were the things that were going on. We have race as a central tenet here. We had the noose that was hung, and our response literally was to get folks into the building to start making sure that we were taking care of people, particularly our students and our staff that were involved as well. And so as we go through, I'm going to really tie into the 3 different components of our staff response, our messaging and communication response, and our institutional response. And so I'm going to ask us to think about some of our own situations on our own campus from those 3 lenses, because we recognize that for us, that sort of encompassed and sort of took us into different avenues of continuing to support our staff, but also address the issue that was at hand. What was nice with this, I shouldn't really use that word. What was great about the fact of our response was that our CSU president showed up on a Sunday night of opening weekend to talk to everyone in that residence hall particularly, and he used some very strong language around shining a light on evil, nasty white supremacist behavior, essentially, is what the words he was using. And so we had a vice president, an assistant vice president, our director of housing was there, the RD of the building was there, his supervisor, which is one of the assistant directors, was there. The RD of the building also identifies as a Black male, so therefore there was some other tension points around there around trying to make sure he was taken care of, not only from the standpoint of being a staff member having to support his staff, but being an individual identifying as a Black identified person in a predominantly white community on a predominantly white campus. And so this was some of our responses. We sent out emails to folks, to the whole building, letting them know what had taken place and what we will not stand for in our communities, and asking for anyone with information to come forward. Unfortunately, no one did, but we definitely did our best to reach out to the community for sure. So supporting our staff specifically, what we've looked at was we wanted to make sure that there was presence in the hall where the incident happened. So for that day, which was on a Saturday, and then that following Sunday, we had staff there available to chat and to talk with individuals. We attended forums that supported impacted identities and discussions of diversity issues on campus. So definitely made sure that upper administration staff were at programming that took place in that community and other communities to make sure that they could see a presence that was there. A lot of our student staff just felt grateful that people were showing up and were at least checking in with them. We shared the incident with the department itself. So we had a conversation at our meeting following, like 3 days after the incident occurred, our weekly meeting. We talked about the incident. We talked about what we need to be doing with our staff. How do we share that within our RA staff specifically, and how do we share that out to students who might have heard through the, social media grapevine as to what was going on. We did individual check-ins with impacted and responding staff. One of the things that I know we didn't do well, and we talk about this all the time, and we put it a part of our practice now, is the RA that was at specifically their floor. We didn't necessarily ask them if they wanted to move buildings. We asked if they were okay, and in the moment they were like, yeah, I'm fine, but it came out later that after a few days, there was this feeling of like, wow, I'm still stuck in this community at this moment, or I don't have a place to go. So definitely when you're supporting your staff, thinking about all the avenues in which you can definitely support your staff. And then last, it was hosting open forums in the department with outside facilitators so staff can share their personal impacts and feelings. When you think about your staff, it's really thinking about the fact that they are also individuals who are impacted by these things. So we need to make sure that we're holding both places for them as not only individuals in our department, but also the fact that they are staff members who have to carry out policy and procedures for us. So I'm going to give you some time as a team to answer the following questions in any way. You can answer one or any of them, but just to give you some ideas as to where you can go with how you're responding to issues, or if you haven't thought of something previously because of the incident you're thinking about. So think about your incident and who would you call on to help? Not only just maybe the police or a supervisor, but are there individuals across campus that you have great relationships with who understand your work and can support you all with that? Who typically shows up for you all? What offices may you need to build a connection with, or community agencies if you don't have folks on campus? What policies can you cite to students and staff involved in your response? So what are your policies? You just want to create that bullet list for this. And then as you think about identities and impact, what are some strategies that you can utilize to support impacted staff and responding staff? So take a few minutes just to answer this wherever it feels natural. So if you find yourself still coming up with more questions like who could we call, or who should we involve, or what should we be responding to, those are great questions to write down for your team so that you can continue to have that with you as you go forth in building policy or procedures or response protocols to make sure that those questions are being answered. I recognize that giving you the time that I'm giving you is probably still not enough to engage completely with everyone that might be wanting to share and talk, but I know that this should only be the start of a conversation. Much like with even in-person conversations, there'd still be that awkward time where the facilitator brings you back together and you still want to have that one thing to share. But I definitely encourage you to write their questions down and write items down so that you all can continue to revisit this, because again, this gets to that solution-oriented thinking around responding to incidences, which will hopefully give you even more questions as you go talk to a general counsel or get the student affairs vice president or get administrators around the table to really figure out how your university should be responding to these incidences. So I want to move from supporting staff into messaging and communication response. So I'm going to share what we did and what we learned from our response to the incident with the noose. We sent an email to Newsom Hall and copied and sent a copy to all the other residence halls that we have. And so Newsom Hall is where the noose was found. And so definitely wanted to make sure that we are reaching out to those students first and foremost. President Frank and the public safety team sent the campus email talking about what occurred and what had happened and how they do not condone this type of behavior and how they feel as though this behavior is not acceptable here at Colorado State and should not be condoned here at Colorado State. So again, encourage students to step up where they might see or hear things taking place. We coordinated a media response, so between the newspapers, and we did have news vans on campus, also our own social media site, because it went up on social media. People were starting to talk back and forth around that, and so we had that coordinated. We host a We Are CSU program the Saturday of opening, so the day that this noose went up, most of our students, not all of them, but our first year students are encouraged to attend, excuse me, our diversity program on campus, which is an oxymoron in some ways. And so we had a campus speaker talk about who we are as CSU and that we are all part of CSU. And so we created a poster and social media messaging around the messages that were brought forth in that speech so that it was posted in all of our buildings. And then last but not least, we launched the No Place for Hate campaign. And we also later on in the year hosted a CS Unite event. And so what we learned from this was transparency. We have to be open with what's going on because our students and our staff are going to hold us accountable based upon why we're holding things back and what we're holding back. And we know that we can't always share every piece of information because some of it might be personnel related or for the safety of all folks involved. But we know that this was a conversation that had happened that came out from our students and our staff. We did have action and not just words, so we needed to put things into play and not just send a message, but also having people in the place to speak on this, having programmatic initiatives, having folks, have the campaign start up. It was something about having action behind those words because a lot of times it's just words that are thrown around. Students and faculty and staff didn't understand the line between free speech, bias incident, and hate crime. So this is where that committee that I had mentioned earlier that we convened within the Student Affairs Department that brought together all of our departments as well as General Counsel to talk about how do we educate our students, our staff, and our faculty. Our Vice President for Diversity's office did the same thing for our staff and faculty and held listening sessions around the First Amendment and what free speech means and what they're able to do in their classrooms, outside of their classrooms if someone else says something and how to respond. And then the last part, it was hard to balance transparency with student privacy. So after this incident, we had another 3 or 4 incidences occur within the month that were all pretty egregious in some ways. Some of them made it to social media. Some of them were just on whiteboards. But the reality was that we were having to respond on a frequent basis in a lot of ways. So we got to enact our campus emails, and then the president also tagged onto a few of those as well because of some of the incidences that occurred. And so what we realized is that we had to build a rapport with our communications department, not only within our housing and dining services, but within the public safety team and the communication external relations team at the cabinet level as well. So thinking about what your resources are on campus is definitely going to be huge for your team, as knowing how to move forward. With our No Place for Hate campaign that I'll touch on briefly as well, is that was started out of our office. There was 4 of us in an office, 3 assistant directors and a director, kicking around ideas. And really that personal response that I talked to you about around wanting to choke someone, we were all in there angry and fired up. And we were like, this can't happen. And really the first thing that came out of my mouth, and I'll own it, and I was like, this shit ain't right. And I said that, and everyone just sort of looked at me like, no, it's not. And I'm like, and then I was like, so how do we get that message across that it's not right and that it has no place here? And as you see, that's where it sort of came out. And so some other folks were like, oh, how about No Place for Hate? So we really thought about it, and we said, this is what we're going to do as a housing unit. And we just sort of started it. And then as you can see from the examples on your screen, is that our campus really embodied it. Our rec center took it and put their own spin on it. See, there's posters and decals and stickers that we have that students have been able to pick up. And then the CS Unite pictures are on the left-hand side. There was an event that students organized, and it was a rally and a march that occurred on our campus and had a whole bunch of folks come together in our big free speech plaza area where we had speakers and had folks talk about what it meant for us not to be afraid to speak up and stand out against hate, because it has no place at CSU. What we did learn from our No Place for Hate campaign is that it was just symbolic, and that there was not this action behind it. It was just words. And so we figured, how do we still continue to make that a more active and vibrant piece of our community, which is where CS Unite came from. We did have lanyards and pins and stickers and fidget spinners and everything else with No Place for Hate written on it, again, just to try to reach a large crowd of folks. So again, here's some more questions for you all to answer, just to take some notes down for, is like, what are the various levels of communication that can occur in housing and through the college and university? Depending upon your size, you might actually have access to email all of your students, and you might not have to get approval. Depending upon your campus and policies, you might have to get approval first. So who controls those resources, and are they at your department table? If not, how do you invite them, and who should you be inviting? Who can you partner with to achieve your goals? And what strategies and avenues do you have available to your department that you may enact or infuse messages into? For our campus, we have a residential curriculum, so we can have intentional conversations with each of our students. So how do we give our wording and stuff like that to our students? And then we have our university housing policy, so when we have student conduct. So take a couple minutes to just jot down a few answers to some of these questions that you might have, or feel free to take a picture of it, or you'll get it uploaded later to YouTube. All right, in the interest of time and not keeping you all too long on a Friday afternoon, I want to move into the institutional response area. So again, just to share a few things of what we've done on our campus or are continuing to do. And then, and you'll see the pattern. There'll be time for you all to think about for what you all could potentially do institutionally. But for policies and process, we created a database for reporting bias-related incidences that was campus-wide rather than just within housing currently. We wanted another one because we knew incidences were taking place outside of our residence halls and in the community, and we wanted to be able to track that, to do like a campus climate map of where things are occurring. We created a bias assessment team campus-wide to respond to anything that comes through on our database. We do have a representative from housing sitting on that as well. That's the role that I play within housing and dining here at CSU. We do have a bias-related incident protocol within housing and dining that we sort of built and further expanded upon. And then campus-wide, there's another protocol that was developed with flow charts and stuff. But for our housing and dining, we wanted to make sure that we trained our environmental technicians, our maintenance staff, and our dining staff as well, because they are in our halls and they might see things. And so we want to make sure that they are addressing things the way that they know how to and making sure that they're reporting issues. We're creating a bystander intervention program, both campus-wide and within housing and dining, to roll out soon. We have a supervisory leadership series that's a campus-wide requirement now. So it's a training that has at least 2 classes have to be diversity focused on inclusive excellence that all of our supervisors are required to take now. Our president made that announcement. And that people had 3 years to get their whole requirement done. So there's 2 diversity classes and then 2 different specific supervision classes that they have to take. And then it's a certificate if you decide to take more classes outside that 4. And then we did a free speech forum development that I mentioned earlier for staff, faculty, and students. For outreach purposes, we do community messaging still. And then that CS Unite program was one of the institutional responses for outreach. So again, having a large campus and a Research One institution, there's a lot of people and a lot of moving parts that we have to sit at the table, but it's finding those avenues and finding those partners that you have that will get you a seat at the table. For us, we are very connected to our Student Affairs Vice President's office. So therefore, if there's something that's going on, they know to involve housing and to make sure that housing has a seat at the table. And so just figuring out where can you leverage your partnerships. And again, it's going to depend on what your campus size is and what your what your housing department already has their feet in already. So evaluate the following for your campus. If you do not have support from an institutional lens, what strategies can you employ? What are programs that you can do? What are messages you can send? What are campaigns that you can potentially start, and not having to be a large campaign that requires a lot of resources, but what are messages that you can send or put on bulletin boards or include in your housing applications to first-year students and returning students who are applying to live with you? And then how can you build proactive partnerships to assist if/when a bias-related incident occurs? So going back to your list of who those partnerships might be, how might you seek out those partnerships differently? How might you invite them to a meal to sit down and just learn about the work that they do? How do you invite them to the table when you're redesigning policies and procedures? This is going to be key in helping to build those response networks for the bias and hate incidences, because we know that they're not going to go anywhere anytime soon. And you want to make sure that you have institutional support, but also you have the people sitting at the table who can actually make things happen for you as well. And so the things to remember are supporting your staff. And when you support your staff, you need to be supporting yourselves as well, because you are a staff member as well. And these things can bring up a lot for folks depending upon the identities that we hold and how we are connected into the incidences that occur. When you think about messaging and crisis communications, think about what messaging currently exists and what you want the message to be. Your university communications department might not want to go as hard as you do on certain language, so you might have to mitigate and navigate what that language might be. But you need to find that support and ask the questions and raise the concerns that you have, so to see if they can provide you with a valid reason as to why they don't want to say a certain word or use certain terminology. Institutional response. What is your institution's response and how do you build upon it, right? If you don't have a current institutional response, then how can you create one from scratch that's for your housing office specifically? And then you know some of the partnerships that you have that might want to build in and help you with that. If you know there are other places that don't have as many resources that you have, but you know that they want to respond to things too, build that coalition between the two of you all. Policies and procedures that are in place. What can you already call upon to drive your agenda? Are there discrimination policies, housing policies, student code of conduct, advertising policies, or safety protocols that you can help that will establish and build. I know for us with our bias-related incident, we're able to name all of those different identities because our non-discrimination policy at the university protects those. So we're able to say, this is what we're going to address. And it's ever growing. Since I've been here, it's already added like 5 or 6 identities that weren't there when I got here 8 years ago. The collaborative partnerships, I know I've emphasized that a lot, but I want to talk about it one more time. Who is your friend, right? How do you establish those friendships and then get that relationship of that, what can we do for you that you can also do for us? How do you help each other? Who do you need to have in your corner to be successful? We know that the higher up it goes, the harder sometimes it is to build those relationships, but who has their ear? Who is in need of the response and the support that you can offer as well? And it's really utilizing and leveraging all of your relationships. If as the director, you don't have the bandwidth, or as an RD, you have to check in with an AD or an RD first before, use everyone at your disposal in your housing office to build those partnerships and relationships, because that will help make it personal sometimes, and that will also help get people in your corner. And then last but not least are the resources that are available. What can you already do? So what does your programming model look like? How do you establish bulletin board protocol and policies? Do a certain bulletin board at the beginning of the year have to have certain elements to it? If you have residential curriculum on your campus, how do you infuse this as part of the scaffolding of your strategies and initiatives? What does your housing contract look like? Your student code of conduct look like? If there's an honor code, what are all those resources that are available to you? And then how do you then utilize the programmatic efforts that are happening across campus and the community to supplement all of that? It's imperative to look beyond housing in order for housing to be at the table, because you all touch usually almost every student that walks through the door of your university with upwards of 90+%, particularly as residential communities. And so how can you stress that you are in the battle and in the trenches for student retention and student success with the rest of your university, because you play that pivotal role? So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions that you might have. What I want to say before as you start sending questions, if you have any or if you don't, is think about the list that you've been creating throughout this time and what questions that you have left that you need to be asking at your university. Think about the resources that you have available to you, because that should be your roadmap to a solution-oriented thinking process and responding to hate and bias incidences. Thank you. Are there any questions other than how's the weather in Colorado? Well, seeing none, the chair recognizes that the meeting should be adjourned.
Yes, thank you, Kyle, for sharing that awesome information and what's going on at Colorado State. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and we'll upload that to the AIMHO YouTube page probably within the next week or so. And you can find that link from the aimho.org website. Be on the lookout for future webinars. And once again, if you're interested in sharing some things that are going on your campus, don't hesitate to reach out to us about hosting your own webinar. Once again, let's give Kyle a big thank you for sharing his experiences and knowledge with the region. Thanks, Kyle.
Thank you. And send questions if you have them.
Great. Have a great weekend, everyone.
All right. Bye.
Bye.